The gray sky hung low over the Pocono Mountains, the kind of heavy autumn sky that pressed on a man's chest and made every breath feel like labor. Rob Mitchell stood among the rows of weathered gravestones, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. In front of him lay the polished granite marker that bore the names of his wife and his son. Fresh flowers had wilted in the vase, their petals darkened by the morning rain. He crouched slowly, brushing a few dead leaves away with a trembling hand. His face was pale, and his eyes carried that hollowed-out look of someone who had been staring into emptiness too long. 3 years had passed, yet the image of that night still clung to him like a second skin. A truck had come barreling through an intersection on Route 209, its driver drunk, its brakes useless. Rob had been a step behind, delayed by a call from the precinct. His wife and little boy never made it home. Their car was crushed against the guardrail, metal bent like paper. He remembered the sirens, the flashing lights, and the voices of the paramedics that turned quieter when they saw him. The driver, the man who had shattered his life, had walked out of the courthouse free. A suspended sentence. Money had changed hands. Favors had been called in. That was the day Rob Mitchell, once a respected investigator with the Monroe County Sheriff's Department, stopped believing in justice. He resigned within a week, turning in his badge and gun. The law, he told himself, wasn't built for people like him, or for the dead he buried. Rob stayed crouched at the grave, whispering words that no one else would hear. "I'm sorry. I should have been there." His voice cracked, and the wind carried it away. He touched the carved names, his thumb tracing the letters as though memorizing them all over again. Then he stood, shoulders slumped, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. The cemetery was empty except for a few crows perched on the iron fence. Their cries followed him as he walked down the gravel path. The world around him blurred into muted colors. The wet grass, the pale stones, the sky sinking into dusk. Every step seemed heavier than the last. By the time he reached the road, his chest felt tight, the air thick. He drove aimlessly, his truck winding through the mountain roads. He wasn't heading home. Home was just a cabin filled with silence, a fridge with little more than beer and leftovers, and a chair by the window where he sat most nights, staring at nothing. Tonight, the emptiness had grown unbearable. He found himself at the old steel bridge that crossed the Delaware River, a place where the mountains dipped low and the water ran fast. He parked on the shoulder and stepped out, the chill wind biting through his clothes. The river churned below, dark and endless, pulling at the rocks with a force that promised oblivion. Rob walked to the middle of the bridge, his boots echoing on the metal grating. He leaned on the railing, staring down into the black water. His fingers tightened around the cold steel as thoughts he had buried for months clawed their way to the surface. What was left for him? His family was gone. His work had betrayed him. Every day was just another repetition of grief. He thought about how quick it would be. Just one step, the fall, the silence, and then nothing. Maybe then he would see his wife and son again. The wind howled in his ears, carrying the scent of wet leaves and river moss. He closed his eyes. For a long moment, he just listened to the current, to the hollow beat of his own heart, to the whisper that told him no one would miss him if he let go. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the railing tighter. The memory of his sons' laughter rose in his mind, sharp as glass. The way the boy used to run across the yard with his toy airplane, shouting that he'd fly higher than the clouds. Rob's chest ached, and his breath caught in a ragged sob. He pulled back from the edge, pressing his palms to his face. He wasn't ready. Not tonight. But the darkness followed him, step for step, as he turned away from the river. He staggered back to his truck, slammed the door shut, and sat there in silence with the engine off, the sound of the rushing water still echoing in his ears. The bridge had not taken him, but the thought lingered, pressing close, promising release. Somewhere inside, a faint, stubborn ember of survival remained, though he couldn't name why. For Rob Mitchell, life had narrowed into a corridor of grief, and tonight was only the beginning of a story he never expected to live. The night grew colder as Rob steered his truck along the winding road that hugged the edge of the Pocono forest. The storm had passed hours earlier, but the air still carried the smell of wet pine and earth. He wasn't sure why he was driving there, maybe just to get away from the silence of the cabin, maybe to outrun the thoughts that had nearly pushed him off the bridge. Then he saw it. At first, he thought it was debris washed down from the storm. A dark shape at the edge of the embankment, half hidden by brush. He slowed, headlights sweeping across the roadside, and his chest tightened when he realized it wasn't debris at all. A young woman lay sprawled on the ground, motionless, her pale face framed by damp hair. Beside her sat a large dog, its coat matted, its eyes burning with fierce loyalty. The animal growled low when Rob pulled over, but didn't move away from her side. Rob stepped out slowly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'm not here to hurt her." The dog stayed alert, tail stiff but didn't lunge. Its protective stance was enough to make Rob's throat tighten. He knew devotion when he saw it. He crouched beside the woman, gently touching her wrist, a pulse weak but there. Her skin was clammy, and her breathing shallow. She looked to be in her late 20s, maybe younger, with the kind of delicate features that suggested she had once lived a very different life than this. Her clothes were damp and torn, her shoes muddy from miles of walking. Rob glanced around the empty road. Out here, no ambulance would come fast enough. He couldn't carry her alone, not with the dog guarding her every movement. He straightened, waving down the single pair of headlights approaching from the curve. A beat-up delivery truck rattled to a stop, the driver rolling down his window with suspicion written on his face. "What's going on?" the man asked. Rob explained quickly, keeping it simple. A girl unconscious, needed to get her somewhere safe. The driver hesitated, then climbed out to help. Between the three of them, Rob lifting her carefully, the stranger keeping the dog at bay with cautious patience, they managed to settle her in the back seat of Rob's truck. The dog, after a tense pause, leapt in beside her, resting its head protectively on her lap. Rob pressed a crumpled bill into the driver's hand. "Thanks. That's enough." The man only nodded, muttered something about the crazy things you see in these mountains, and drove off into the night. The cabin felt different when Rob carried her inside. He had long grown used to its silence, but now every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder. He laid her carefully on the old sofa, covering her with a wool blanket he hadn't used in years. The dog, Max, he would later learn, watched his every move, its eyes following him with suspicion and trust in equal measure. Rob moved with awkward gentleness. He filled a bowl with water, placed it near the dog, then searched the pantry for something edible. The only thing he had was a half-empty bag of kibble he sometimes used for strays. Max sniffed it, then devoured the food as though it hadn't eaten in days. Afterward, Rob fetched a towel, kneeling beside the dog. "You need this more than I do," he muttered, rubbing the mud from its fur. Max stiffened, then relaxed slowly under his touch. Rob almost smiled. It had been years since he had felt anything close to companionship. He turned back to the girl. She stirred once, lips parting as though caught in a dream. He checked her again, still breathing though shallow. He left a glass of water within reach and settled into his chair across the room. For the first time in years, Rob stayed awake through the night, not because of grief, but because of something uncertain, something like responsibility. By dawn, the forest outside was covered in mist. The first light spilled through the cabin window, painting the room in pale gray. Rob heard a rustle, then the creak of the sofa springs. The girl was awake. She blinked, confused, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room until it landed on him. Rob stood, cautious, not wanting to startle her. "You're safe," he said softly. "You passed out by the road. I brought you here." Her lips moved, voice barely above a whisper. "Where am I?" My place, just outside Stroudsburg. You've been out all night." He paused, then added gently, "You should drink some water." She sat up slowly, Max pressing close to her side. She took the glass with shaking hands, sipping before setting it down again. Her eyes, clear but shadowed with fear, met his. "Thank you," she said, her tone hesitant, as though unused to kindness. Then, after a long pause, she added quietly, "My name is Sarah." Rob nodded once. "Rob Mitchell." The silence stretched between them, fragile but steady, until Max broke it with a soft bark. Sarah reached down, stroking the dog's head, her lips curving into the faintest, most uncertain smile. And in that moment, Rob felt something shift. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew the night on the bridge hadn't been his last after all. For the first few minutes after she woke, Sarah barely spoke. She sat on the edge of the sofa, one hand resting on Max's head, the other gripping the blanket as though she feared it might vanish. Rob moved slowly around the room, brewing coffee that filled the cabin with a smell it hadn't carried in months. When he handed her a mug, she accepted it with both hands, eyes lowered. "You have somewhere you need to be?" he asked, his voice cautious, almost formal. Sarah shook her head, strands of dark hair falling across her face. "No, nowhere." The silence that followed was heavy, but Rob recognized it. He had lived inside that kind of silence for years. She didn't want to explain, and he wasn't the kind of man to push. He leaned back against the counter, staring at her in the soft light of morning. "Well," he said at last, "this place has more room than I need. You can stay a while. No strings." Her eyes flicked up, surprise evident. "Stay? As a guest? Or a friend, if you want to call it that." His tone was steady, practical, but inside, something about the words unsettled him. He had avoided company since the funeral. Now, without thinking, he was offering it. Sarah hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Thank you. Just for a little while." From that day, the rhythm of the cabin began to change. Sarah started small, folding the blanket she had used, rinsing her mug without being asked. But within a week, she was doing more, wiping counters, sweeping the floor, reorganizing the shelves as if it were second nature. She cooked simple meals, the kind Rob hadn't bothered with since his wife died. The smell of fresh bread and simmering soup replaced the stale odor of beer and dust. Rob tried not to notice, but he did. Each evening when he returned from a walk, the cabin looked less like a tomb and more like a home. And yet, the distance between them remained. She never offered details about her life, and he never asked. Max, however, cared nothing for boundaries. The dog moved freely between them, his wagging tail and insistent presence softening the space. If Rob sat at the table too long, Max nudged his hand until he rose to take him outside. If Sarah looked too pale, Max climbed onto the sofa and pressed his warm body against her side. More than once, Rob caught himself smiling at the sight. One evening, after Sarah had made stew, Rob sat back in his chair and studied her. She was stirring her bowl absently, eyes distant. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "At what?" "Making a place feel alive again." Her lips curved in something like a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's easier to keep busy." Rob nodded. He knew that truth too well. The days slipped into a pattern. Sarah cleaned, cooked, and kept mostly to herself. Rob chopped wood, repaired things around the property, and stayed out of her way. They spoke in short exchanges, polite, careful, restrained. Yet beneath it all, an unspoken understanding grew. They were two broken people sharing the same space, each carrying ghosts the other couldn't see. It didn't take long for the neighbors to notice. In small towns near the Pocono foothills, change never stayed private for long. Mrs. Carter, who lived down the road, saw Sarah carrying groceries into the cabin and later told her sister-in-law that Rob Mitchell had finally let someone in. At the diner, whispers spread. He's not drinking alone every night anymore. There's a young woman staying with him. Maybe he's moving on. The gossip reached Rob eventually, through sideways glances and the way conversations hushed when he walked in. He ignored it, but deep down he knew what they meant. For years, people had pitted him, the widower who had lost everything. Now, they looked at him differently, almost expectantly, as if waiting to see whether life would return to him. Back at the cabin, he caught Sarah humming once while she worked, a tune soft and almost forgotten. The sound startled him, reminding him of a time before loss had carved him hollow. He didn't comment, but that night, as he sat by the window with a cup of coffee, he realized the air in the house felt lighter. Still, distance lingered. Sometimes he'd find her staring out the window for long stretches, her face shadowed with something he couldn't name. Sometimes she startled when he entered a room, as if pulled back from far away. He wanted to ask what haunted her, but the words never came. Instead, he let Max carry the weight of bridging the gap. The dog bounded between them, tail wagging, as if determined to stitch their lives together one moment at a time. And slowly, against the silence of the mountains, against the grief still gnawing at both their hearts, the cabin began to breathe again. The October evenings came early in the mountains. By 6, the forest outside was already cloaked in shadows, and the cabin glowed dimly under the soft light of a single lamp. Rob sat at the table with Sarah across from him, the remains of dinner between them. She had cooked again, chicken stew with biscuits, and though he rarely said much, he ate every bite. Tonight, however, the silence stretched longer than usual. He set down his spoon, fingers tracing the rim of his bowl. "You ever lose something," he asked slowly, "that you know you'll never get back?" Sarah stilled, her spoon hovering in midair. She didn't answer, and for a long moment, Rob thought she might rise and leave. But then she lowered the spoon gently, her eyes fixed on him. He drew in a breath, the words scraping out of him like rusted nails. "My wife, my boy, 3 years ago, car accident. Some drunk came tearing through the intersection." His jaw tightened. They didn't make it. Sarah's face softened, her hands folding in her lap. Rob tried to hold himself steady, but the floodgates had opened. The man who did it walked free. Money and connections bought him a slap on the wrist. Suspended sentence. He laughed bitterly, though no humor touched the sound. The law was supposed to mean something. It didn't. His chest heaved as he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I told myself I was done. With justice. With people. With everything. Sometimes I still think about ending it." The words hung heavy in the air. For years, he had carried them in silence, and now, spoken aloud, they shook him to the core. His eyes burned, and before he could stop himself, a tear slid down his cheek. He pressed a hand against his face, ashamed. But then he felt a light touch. Sarah had risen from her chair and stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said softly. Rob turned slightly, his gaze catching hers. Her eyes shone with something he couldn't name. Sorrow, maybe, or recognition. She gave the smallest of nods, as though she understood grief too well. For the first time in years, the dam broke. His shoulders shook, and he let the tears come, silent but raw. Sarah didn't flinch. She simply stayed by his side, her hand steady against him, anchoring him as the weight poured out. When it was over, when he had nothing left but exhaustion, he sat slumped in the chair, his breath ragged. Sarah returned quietly to her seat, her expression unreadable. "You've lost someone too," he said finally, his voice hoarse. Her eyes flickered down to her hands. "I've lost more than I can explain." Rob waited, but she didn't elaborate. She only gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "Let's just say I know what it's like to have the ground pulled out from under you." Something inside him ached to press further, to ask her what story lay behind those words. But he stopped himself. Whatever her pain was, she wasn't ready to share it. He understood that. In the days that followed, something shifted between them. Their conversations grew longer, though still careful. Rob found himself listening for her footsteps in the cabin, for the sound of her humming when she thought she was alone. He caught her watching him once as he split wood outside, her expression soft, almost wistful. And yet, whenever closeness seemed to take root, she pulled back. If he brushed her hand accidentally, she flinched, then forced a polite smile. If he lingered too long in conversation, she excused herself with some chore. It was as if she balanced on the edge of wanting connection and fearing it. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Rob found himself leaning closer. They were talking quietly about nothing in particular. Books she had read, the kind of music he used to play in the car. He noticed the way her lips curved, the warmth in her eyes. For a heartbeat, the air between them thickened. He almost reached for her hand. Almost. But then she shifted, her gaze dropping to Max, who lay stretched across the rug. She bent down, stroking the dog's head, as if reminding herself of the safe distance she needed to keep. Rob leaned back, the moment dissolving. Sarah straightened and glanced at him briefly, her smile tight. "It's late. We should get some rest." He nodded, swallowing whatever words had been rising in his throat. That night, as he lay awake listening to the creak of the old cabin, he realized they were bound by a strange thread: grief, loss, the hollow spaces left behind. But while he had let her glimpse his scars, she kept hers hidden behind walls he couldn't yet reach. And so, their lives moved forward in a fragile dance, moments of closeness, quickly shadowed by retreat. The cabin held their silences, their half-finished words, their almost touches, and though neither dared to name it, something had begun to take root between them, fragile as a flame in the wind. It was late one night when Sarah finally began to unravel her story. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the cabin roof, and the fire snapped in the hearth. Rob sat in his chair, Max curled at his feet, when Sarah drew in a long breath and spoke without looking at him. "My family wasn't like most families around here," she began, her voice low but clear. "We had money, not the kind you stumble into, but the kind that gets passed down generation after generation. My father owned a manufacturing company out of Allentown. He built it with his own hands, grew it into something solid. He always said one day it would be mine." Rob turned slightly, listening, careful not to interrupt. "My mother was softer, gentle, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make it feel safe. She believed in kindness, in listening before speaking. And then there was Lauren." Her lips curved, but there was no warmth in the smile. "Lauren was my little sister, younger by 3 years, but always louder, brighter, more demanding. My father adored her, but not the way he trusted me. He used to say I had his head for business. Lauren didn't want that. She wanted everything else, the attention, the freedom, the spotlight. And when she couldn't get it, she made sure everyone knew she'd been wronged." Sarah shifted in her chair, staring into the fire. "Dad was clear about it. He wanted me to take over the company when the time came. Lauren never forgave me for that. She hid it under jokes and smiles, but I could feel it. She thought I was stealing her place in the world." The flames flickered, shadows cutting across her face. And then came Christopher Dalton. She paused on the name, as though tasting bitterness. He was handsome, charming, the son of one of my father's business partners. On paper, it was perfect. A merger, not just of companies, but of families. My father approved right away. He thought Chris would be good for the future of the business. My mother, not so much. Her voice softened with memory. Mom never trusted him. She never said it outright, not at first, but I could feel it. She'd look at him with this suspicion in her eyes. Once, after he proposed, she pulled me aside. She asked if I was sure. She said he seemed too polished, too rehearsed, like a man trying on an act. I told her she was wrong. I told her I loved him. Rob's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. Sarah's gaze dropped to the fire, and I did, or at least I thought I did. He was attentive, romantic, everything I believed a man should be. He told me I was his whole world, that no one else could ever matter. I was young and I wanted so badly to believe it. So I did. She let out a shaky breath. When we announced our engagement, Lauren put on the show of her life. She smiled, hugged me, told everyone she was thrilled for me. But I saw her eyes when no one else was looking. Cold, angry, as if I had taken something from her, though I couldn't understand what. Max stirred, resting his head on Sarah's lap. Her hand drifted to stroke his fur absently, grounding herself in the touch. The wedding was grand. My father spared no expense. Guests filled the hall. Music played until morning. To everyone, it looked like the perfect match, two families uniting, a bright future ahead. And Lauren stood by my side, smiling like she was proud. But I knew her too well. Underneath the smile, she hated me for it. Hated that I had my father's trust, the company's future, and now a husband she couldn't control. Her voice cracked slightly as she went on. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that once she saw me happy, she'd let go of her bitterness. But I was wrong. I didn't see how deep it ran. I didn't see what it would cost me. Rob leaned forward slightly, his face etched with quiet concern. He didn't push, didn't ask her to go faster. He let her carry the story at her own pace. Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers tightening in Max's fur. Looking back, I think my mother saw it coming. She saw the storm gathering around me, even when I was blind to it. But I was in love, or at least I believed I was. And love, it makes you deaf sometimes. Deaf to warnings, deaf to reason. I thought I had everything. A family that trusted me, a future waiting, and a man who promised me the world. Her eyes lifted finally, meeting Rob's. They were filled with shadows, the kind that only came from old wounds. But I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I didn't even know it. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. Rob said nothing. He simply nodded, his steady gaze telling her he heard every word. And Sarah Caldwell, for the first time, allowed a sliver of her past to step into the room, heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. The early months of Sarah's marriage played out like a script she had once dreamed of. Christopher Dalton was attentive in public, the perfect husband, the perfect son-in-law. Her father praised him at every dinner, already speaking of the future with renewed confidence. "The company will be stronger with you at the helm, Sarah," he told her more than once, his voice full of pride. "And with Chris by your side, there's nothing you can't manage." It was clear what he meant. The transition of power was close. He was preparing to hand her the keys to the business he had built from nothing. To Sarah, it felt like stepping into her destiny, honoring her father's trust, carrying the family legacy forward. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. She remembered the night she first stumbled onto the truth. It was late, the house quiet. She had gone upstairs to find Christopher, only to hear voices through the half-open door of his study. One voice was unmistakably his, the other her sister's, Lauren's. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. She leaned closer, every word carving into her like glass. "She believes every word I tell her," Christopher was saying, his tone cold, calculating. Lauren's laugh followed, sharp and bitter. "Of course she does. She's always believed she's smarter than me. Let her think that. Once she's out of the picture, the company is ours." Sarah's knees weakened. She clutched the banister to keep from collapsing, every instinct screaming to burst in and demand answers. But her body wouldn't move. She stood there in silence, listening to the man she loved and the sister she trusted, conspiring to erase her from her own life. The days after that blurred into dread. She carried the knowledge like a hidden wound, forcing smiles at family dinners, pretending not to notice the glances between Lauren and Christopher. At night, she lay awake beside him, the echo of their voices burning in her ears. Then came the trip to the mountains. Christopher had suggested it, saying they all needed a break. The Pocono trails were familiar, a place Sarah had hiked since childhood. Her father stayed behind for business meetings, but Lauren insisted on joining. "Sister's time," she said brightly, her smile stretched too wide. The climb started peacefully enough, the air crisp, the forest alive with color. But as they reached the ridge, Sarah felt the shift. The narrow path wound along a cliffside, the ground damp from morning rain. She glanced at Lauren, who lingered just a step too close, her eyes glinting with something Sarah couldn't mistake anymore. They stopped near an overlook, the valley stretching below in a breathtaking sweep of green and stone. Sarah stepped to the edge, her chest tightening. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Behind her, Lauren's footsteps slowed. "You've always had everything, haven't you?" Lauren's voice was flat, almost calm. Sarah turned slowly. "That's not true. You had Dad's trust, his company, and now Chris." Her eyes narrowed. "You were never going to share. You were never going to let me have a piece of it." Sarah's stomach dropped. "You don't know what you're saying. You think Chris loves you? You think he's not using you like—" Lauren lunged forward. It happened fast, too fast. Sarah felt the shove against her shoulder, the ground crumbling beneath her boots. She gasped, arms flailing, fingers clawing at the air. For a heartbeat, she was certain she would fall. The world tilted, the valley yawning below. But it was Lauren who slipped. Her foot skidded on the wet rock, her balance gone. She let out a sharp cry as her body pitched forward. Sarah reached instinctively, their fingers brushing for the briefest second before Lauren's hand slid away. And then she was gone. The sound of the fall echoed through the gorge, a hollow thud swallowed by silence. Sarah staggered back, her body shaking, her breath tearing from her chest. She dropped to her knees, staring into the void, waiting for a miracle that never came. Panic consumed her. She could already see how it would look. Her sister dead, her husband's betrayal still hidden. Who would believe her? Who would believe that Lauren had tried to kill her and that her death had been an accident of her own making? She ran. Through the trees, down the path, her lungs burning, her mind screaming. She didn't stop until she was miles from the trailhead, mud streaking her clothes, her hands raw from grabbing at branches. She didn't go home. She didn't call the police. By the time she reached the nearest town, word had already spread. A body had been found, or at least so people thought. In the confusion, in the chaos, her identity blurred. She heard whispers in the days that followed. It was Sarah. Sarah had fallen. Lauren survived. Somewhere, a coffin was lowered into the ground with her name on the stone. Somewhere, her parents wept for a daughter they thought they had lost. And Sarah Caldwell, still alive, was forced into the cruelest disguise of all. To survive, she became Lauren. In the weeks after the fall, Sarah moved like a ghost. She left the mountains with nothing but the clothes on her back, her hands trembling each time she caught her reflection in a shop window. To the world, she was Lauren now. The mix-up at the scene had set the story. Sarah Caldwell had fallen to her death. Lauren had survived. She didn't correct it. She couldn't. She drifted from one small town to another, paying for cheap rooms with the cash she had hidden in her jacket pocket. She used her sister's name whenever someone asked. It came out stiff at first, like an ill-fitting coat, but soon it became the only thing that kept her from unraveling. If Christopher thought Lauren lived, he wouldn't search for Sarah. And if the world thought Sarah was dead, maybe she could disappear. But at night, when the motel lights flickered and the silence pressed too close, she heard her parents' voices. She pictured her father at the graveside, shoulders bent under grief. She pictured her mother's tears, the disbelief etched into her gentle face. The weight of it crushed Sarah's chest. She was alive, yet she had left them to bury the wrong daughter. The guilt was relentless. She tried to write once, an anonymous letter, a message that might reach them without revealing too much. But the words died on the page. How could she explain the truth? That their trusted son-in-law had betrayed them? That Lauren had conspired to kill her? That she had run, leaving them to mourn the wrong child? No, she thought bitterly they would never believe it. And so she let the lie stand. It was during those lost months that Max came into her life. She had found the pup outside a gas station on the outskirts of Scranton, shivering under a rusted dumpster. He was all ribs and fear, his eyes too big for his small body. She crouched down, whispered gently, and the pup crawled into her arms as though he had been waiting for her. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Max grew quickly, his loyalty fierce, his presence a tether that kept her from vanishing completely. But fear shadowed every step she took. Each time she spotted a man in a suit at the corner of a diner, she imagined Christopher had sent someone to find her. Each time she saw a familiar car in the distance, her pulse spiked. He was powerful now, richer than before, and she knew what he was capable of. If he learned she lived, he would finish what he had started. She found work where she could, cleaning motel rooms, stocking shelves at a supermarket, serving coffee in backroad diners. Always for cash, always under the name Lauren Caldwell. Her life shrank to the essentials: food, shelter, safety. Max became her only constant. She slept with him curled against her side, his warm weight the only thing that steadied her trembling at night. Back in Allentown, her family held a funeral. She read about it in a small local paper she had dared to pick up in a diner. The article was short, almost cruel in its simplicity. Sarah Caldwell, beloved daughter and wife, laid to rest after tragic accident. There was a picture of her smiling face, her real face, printed above the obituary. She dropped the paper as if it had burned her fingers. She imagined the scene, the casket lowered into the earth, her parents clutching one another, Christopher standing by with that carefully practiced grief written across his face. The thought made her stomach twist. He had taken everything: her marriage, her family's trust, her identity, and yet he still walked free, respected, powerful. For 3 years, she lived like that, moving town to town, looking over her shoulder, pretending to be someone she wasn't. Each day, she carried the gnawing dread that the truth would catch up with her, and the shame that she had let her family bury a daughter who wasn't gone. By the time she collapsed on that roadside, Sarah Caldwell was a woman hollowed out by secrets. Her body had grown thin, her eyes shadowed, her spirit worn down to threads. If not for Max, she might have given up entirely. And then came Rob. The night he found her was not just another night of wandering. It was the end of her strength. When she woke in his cabin, she felt the fragile safety of being seen and not questioned. Rob asked for nothing, demanded nothing. He offered a roof, a warm meal, and silence that wasn't hostile. But the secret weighed heavier in the presence of his kindness. Each time she caught him watching her with quiet concern, guilt pressed sharper. He didn't know who she really was. He didn't know the trail of lies that led her to his door. And the thought of him finding out made her heart pound with dread. Still, a part of her clung to the fragile thread of hope. Perhaps fate hadn't left her to rot in shadows. Perhaps meeting Rob was more than coincidence. But hope was dangerous, and Sarah Caldwell had learned to fear anything that resembled light. She sat by his fire at night, Max curled at her feet, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She said little, but her silence carried the weight of everything unspoken. Rob didn't press. He let her be. And yet, even in the quiet, she felt her secret clawing at her chest, desperate to be told, terrified of the cost. Meeting him was salvation. Carrying her truth was damnation. And Sarah knew she couldn't keep both forever. The turning point came one cold November evening. Rob and Sarah sat in the cabin, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. She had been pacing for nearly an hour, her hands twisting together, her face pale with the weight of her secret. Finally, Rob spoke, his voice firm but not unkind. "You can't keep running forever, Sarah. He's out there living free while you hide. That's not survival, it's a prison." Her eyes filled with panic. You don't understand what he's capable of. If Christopher finds out I'm alive, he already tried to take your life once, Rob interrupted, leaning forward. If you stay silent, he wins. If you face him, you take back control. She shook her head, tears brimming. I can't. My family buried me. They think Lauren lived. If I come back, how do I even explain that? Rob's voice softened. You explain it with the truth, and I'll be there with you. It took days of convincing, of patient words and quiet determination before Sarah agreed. Rob put his old skills to use, skills he had abandoned when he left law enforcement. He followed Christopher Dalton, learning his routines, the restaurants he favored, the exact table he chose when dining alone. He still carried himself like a man untouchable, his suit sharp, his smile polished, his reputation intact. But Rob saw the cracks, the loneliness in his habits, the arrogance in his patterns. The plan was simple. Rob would lead Sarah into the restaurant at the exact moment Christopher least expected. He would be forced to face her, and his own guilt would do the rest. Rob had prepared a small recorder, tucked neatly into Sarah's purse, ensuring every word would be preserved. On the chosen afternoon, Sarah dressed plainly, her hair tied back, her nerves taut as wires. Rob's steady hand at her back was the only thing that kept her moving forward. The restaurant's bell chimed as they entered, the smell of grilled meat and wine heavy in the air. Christopher Dalton sat at his usual table near the window, cutting into a steak. He glanced up casually, then froze. His fork clattered against the plate, his face draining of color. "Hello, Chris," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She slid into the chair across from him, Rob standing a few feet away, arms crossed. Christopher's lips parted, but no words came. He blinked hard, as though trying to erase the vision in front of him. This isn't possible." "Oh, it's possible," Sarah said. Her hands trembled under the table, but her gaze didn't waver. "You're looking at the woman you and my sister tried to erase." He swallowed, his throat working visibly. You fell. They buried you. They buried a name," she snapped. "But I'm still here, and I remember everything. The late-night meetings, the whispers, the plan to make sure the company passed into your hands." Christopher's composure faltered. He darted a glance around the restaurant, but the midday crowd paid little attention. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Keep your voice down." "Why?" Sarah challenged. "Afraid someone might hear the truth? That you seduced my sister to use her against me? That you sent me hiking so she could push me off the cliff?" Rob's jaw clenched, every muscle taut as he stood guard. Christopher's mask slipped. His eyes darkened, his tone sharp. "You don't understand. Your father was never going to let me near the company unless you were out of the way. You had everything, his trust, the future. Lauren was easy to manipulate. She wanted what you had. All I had to do was give her what she craved, and she did the rest." Sarah's chest heaved. "So you admit it. You never loved me. You never loved her. It was always about power." He sneered. "Love is a tool. Some of us know how to use it." The words cut deeper than any blade. Sarah's hands shook, but she pressed on. "And when Lauren died instead of me?" Christopher shrugged, though his hand trembled as he lifted his glass. "Collateral damage. She wasn't worth much to me without you to push against. But at least everyone believed the story. Sarah dead, Lauren alive. It worked in my favor." Every word fell neatly into the recorder's memory, each syllable sealing his fate. Rob stepped closer, his presence looming. "That's enough." Christopher's eyes flicked up, recognizing him for the first time. Something cold passed between them, the steady strength of a man who had seen justice fail too many times and was ready to restore it by force if needed. "Who the hell are you?" Christopher demanded. "The man who's going to make sure you finally pay," Rob said evenly. Christopher rose suddenly, knocking over his chair, but Rob's hand clamped on his arm before he could bolt. Within minutes, the police arrived, called ahead by Rob, who had made sure backup was waiting. The officers listened as Sarah handed over the recording, her voice steady as she recounted the betrayal, the plot, the near murder. Christopher tried to protest, to weave excuses, but the evidence was damning. His words, his tone, his arrogance, all preserved on tape. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and for the first time, his polished mask shattered into raw panic. Sarah watched as they led him out, her hands trembling but her spine straight. The man who had stolen her life, her family, her very identity was finally stripped of power. Rob stood beside her, steady as ever. "It's over," he said quietly. She shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "No, it's just beginning. I still have to face my family." Rob placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Then we'll face them together." And for the first time in years, Sarah felt the air in her lungs ease. The shadows had started to lift, replaced by the faintest glimmer of justice. The days following Christopher's arrest blurred into a mixture of exhaustion and fragile relief. Sarah spent hours at the station, giving her statement, repeating the story she had carried in silence for 3 years. The recording left little room for denial, his voice, cold and arrogant, admitting everything. But even with justice set in motion, a greater challenge remained: going home. When Rob drove her back to Allentown, the city of her childhood, she sat stiff in the passenger seat, hands clenched tightly in her lap. Max leaned forward from the back seat, resting his chin on her shoulder as though sensing the storm within her. She hadn't seen her parents since the funeral, the one they believed was hers. The thought of their faces when they opened the door made her chest ache with guilt. The Caldwell house loomed large as they pulled into the driveway. Its windows glowed with warm light, so familiar and yet impossibly distant. Rob cut the engine, resting a steady hand on hers. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. Sarah nodded, drawing in a shaky breath. Together, they walked up the stone path. When her mother answered the door, the world seemed to still. For a moment, neither moved. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Then the tears came, her voice breaking on a single word. "Sarah?" Sarah's own tears spilled over. "It's me, Mom. I'm alive." They collapsed into each other's arms, trembling, sobbing, clinging as though afraid the other might vanish. Her father appeared moments later, his face pale as he stumbled forward, then froze, torn between joy and grief. "But they told us you were gone. We buried you." "I know," Sarah whispered through tears. "I let you think that. I was so afraid, and I didn't know how to explain. I thought you wouldn't believe me." Her father's voice cracked. "We lost one daughter, and all this time you were out there alone." He pulled her into his embrace, his arms tight, unrelenting, as though trying to make up for the years of absence. But the joy of reunion soon gave way to sorrow when the truth came out. Sarah sat with them in the living room. Max curled at her feet, Rob close at her side. She told them everything: Christopher's lies, Lauren's betrayal, the hike that turned deadly. She confessed the guilt she had carried,